Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting.
Okay.
This is a question that I think a lot of people have thought about.
Yeah.
Are female scientists less likely to publish their work solo,
Yeah.
like on their own?
Yeah.
And we're going to be going through this 2022 study from the journal Scientometrics to try to figure that out.
Interesting.
And get this,
Yeah.
this study actually looked at every single professor in Poland
Wow.
who had published anything in the Scopus database.
Oh, a pretty big.
That's a lot of data.
Yeah, huge data set.
Huge data set.
Yeah.
And so this is a really in-depth look
It is.
at what the study authors call the gender solo research gap.
The gender solo research gap, yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting things about this study is that this gap might be smaller than a lot of us think.
That's interesting.
But before we get into the specifics
Yeah.
of solo publishing itself, I think we need to zoom out a little bit and think about, all of the gender disparities in science.
Right.
We can't really talk about solo publishing without acknowledging
Yes.
that there are just general challenges that women face
Of course, yeah.
in research. So,
And this study actually found a bunch of different gender gaps in science.
like how many?
16 to be exact.
16.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot to think about.
A lot to think about, yeah.
When we're thinking about this topic of solo publishing,
Uh-huh.
which of those 16 gaps
Oh.
really stood out to you?
I mean, one that immediately comes to mind is self-citation. Women tend to cite their own work less than men.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought about that.
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
Well, you can think about citations as currency.
Okay.
The more your work is cited, the more impact it's seen as having.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if women are citing themselves less, it's kind of downplaying
Right.
the importance of their own work.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense when you put it that way.
Yeah.
Were there any other gaps that you felt like were really connected to?
Another interesting one is how research time is allocated between teaching and research. Even when men and women hold similar positions, women often spend more of their time teaching and doing administrative work, which means less time for research.
Oh, wow.
Makes me wonder if that time crunch
Right.
could play a role in solo publishing as well.
That's a really good point. And
Wait.
it just seems like women are facing these systemic
Yeah.
hurdles
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of different areas of research, which makes me even more curious
Okay.
about this whole solo publishing thing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why it even matters.
Okay.
In a world where everything is becoming more and more collaborative,
Right.
going it alone seems almost
Yeah. It seems
old-fashioned.
Seems old-fashioned, yeah.
So why would a scientist choose to do that?
Well, solo publishing has some important advantages,
Okay, I'm listening.
especially for women. One of the big reasons is it sends a clear signal about your individual abilities as a researcher. There's no question about who did what.
It's true.
And this is particularly beneficial for women who, as we've seen, sometimes don't get full credit
Right?
for collaborative work.
Yeah, that makes me think about studies I've seen in other fields where women were actually penalized in like tenure decision
Oh, wow.
if they co-authored with a man. It's almost like their contribution was seen as less valuable
It's like the system
because they were working with a man.
struggles to recognize a woman's contributions
Wow.
when she's part of a team.
So maybe solo publishing can combat that in a way.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the big question is,
Yeah,
does the data show a huge difference
right.
in solo publishing rates between men and women?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The study did find some differences in solo publishing rates across most disciplines, but those differences were so small they were practically meaningless.
So Polish women are publishing solo at rates very similar
Yes.
to their male counterparts.
Very similar rates.
That's not what I was expecting at all.
Yeah, it really challenges that assumption that women are just less interested in solo research or individual recognition.
So this raises a really big question then.
Yeah.
If gender isn't the driving force here,
Right?
what is? What else did the study find?
Well, the study really dug into that question,
Yeah.
and they found that the most interesting thing was that the biggest factor influencing solo publishing wasn't gender. It was the average team size in a given field.
So the more common it is for researchers to work in big teams,
Exactly.
the less likely we are to see solo publications.
Precisely.
That makes sense.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If a field is already set up for big collaborative projects,
Right.
there just aren't as many opportunities
Yeah.
for solo work.
It's almost like the structure of the field itself
It's the structure
is influencing those publishing patterns,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of gender.
Right.
That's really interesting. Did they find any other patterns related to like...
They found that STEM fields
Okay.
tended to have less solo publishing overall
Wait,
than non-STEM fields.
why do you think that is?
Well, STEM research often requires things like
Yeah.
specialized equipment, massive data sets, expertise from different areas.
Oh, and it naturally leans towards teamwork.
It naturally leans towards teamwork.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Wasn't there something in the study about
Yes.
male-dominated fields actually having more
Yes.
solo publishing?
That was one of the most surprising findings.
Really?
The study found that publishing in a field where men are the majority
Okay.
actually made solo publishing more likely. And that was true for both men and women.
Hold on, so a woman
Yeah.
in a male-dominated field might be more likely
More like,
to publish solo
yes.
than a woman in a field
Yeah.
that has more of a gender balance.
Correct.
That's so...
It is counterintuitive,
Yeah.
and we need more research to understand why this is happening.
Yeah.
One possibility is that women in those fields feel more pressure to prove their expertise
Right.
as individuals.
It's almost like they have to go above and beyond
Yeah.
to be taken seriously
Why is that
in those
wrong?
environments.
Yeah.
Wow, so this is really complicated.
It is complicated.
All these different factors,
Mhm.
and then there's another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
When we look at age and solo publishing,
Yes.
this is one I'm really curious about.
Okay.
You would think that younger researchers,
Uh-huh.
the ones fresh out of their PhD programs,
Yes.
would be more likely to publish solo.
Yeah, you would think so.
Maybe they feel like they have to make a name for themselves early on.
Right. It's a logical assumption.
Yeah.
But the study found something a bit different. It turns out that solo publishing actually peaked for both men and women in middle age,
Oh, wow.
and then declined later in their careers.
Huh. That is surprising.
Yeah.
Do we have any theories about why that might be?
Well, one possibility is that as researchers gain experience and
Yeah.
they build up their networks, they just naturally start to gravitate
Yeah.
towards more collaborative projects.
Right, they've already kind of established their expertise.
They've established their expertise,
Maybe they're looking to branch out,
right, and explore new areas.
work with other people.
Mm.
It also makes me think about like the role of mentorship.
Yes.
Maybe as researchers get more senior, they take on more roles as advisors
Right.
or mentors on these bigger projects
Yeah, that's a great point.
rather than leading their own solo work.
It highlights how our career stage can really
Right.
influence how we approach publishing.
So taking all of this into account,
Yes.
what does it mean? If the gender solo research gap is much smaller
Right.
than we might have assumed.
I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't rely on simple explanations when it comes to gender dynamics in research.
Yeah, it's just not as straightforward as saying.
It's not straightforward.
Women are less interested in solo publishing or
Right.
they shy away from an individual recognition.
It's much more complex than that.
It seems like all these other factors play a huge role.
Yes.
How research is structured in different fields,
Mm-hmm.
the unique pressures of male-dominated disciplines,
Yes.
how our career stage influences what we prioritize.
It paints a much more complex picture.
So if the gender solo research gap
Yeah.
isn't really a significant factor here,
Right.
what does this tell us
Mm.
about the pressures and incentives shaping academic publishing today?
That's a big question.
It seems like there's a bigger story here.
Yeah, I think so. It makes me wonder if
Yeah.
this push to publish in these big teams,
Right.
if that's so strong across almost all fields,
Yeah.
what does that mean for solo scholarship?
Yeah. It's like, are we going to
Yeah.
lose that completely?
Right.
It's almost like all those advantages that we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
that clarity of individual ability,
Right.
avoiding those murky waters of who gets credit for what.
Right.
Maybe all of that gets lost
Yeah.
when everybody's so focused.
It does raise the question of whether we need to rethink
Right.
how we evaluate and reward
Mm-hmm.
different types of research contributions.
Yeah, especially in fields where
Especially,
solo work is still valuable.
right, where it's still really needed.
Like, how do we make sure that
Yeah. How do we make sure it...
individual brilliance
Mhm.
doesn't just get
Right.
overshadowed
Overshadowed.
in
Yeah.
this pursuit of
Yeah.
bigger and bigger research teams?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a tough question, but
Yeah.
this study highlights some important things
Right.
to think about.
We need to find ways to recognize and celebrate all of the different types
Yes, all the different contributions.
of scientific contribution.
From those solo endeavors to those massive collaborations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Each has its place.
Okay, so to kind of wrap things up,
Okay.
it seems like this gender solo research gap
Yeah.
is a lot less dramatic
It's much smaller.
than we initially thought.
So then we thought...
Or the fact that this study looked at the entire Polish higher education system
huge sample size.
with such a massive sample size, it really lends credence to their findings.
Yeah.
But it does leave us with a lot to ponder.
It does.
If gender isn't the main driver here, what does that tell us about
What does it tell us?
the pressures and incentives
Right.
that are shaping academic publishing today?
It's a good question.
Like, if this pressure to publish as part of large teams keeps growing
Yeah.
in pretty much every field, is solo scholarship.
Right? Is it just going to become
It's going to become a thing of the past.
a thing of the past?
Or there's certain
And there's certain types of
scientific questions
that
that are always going to benefit
will always
from the focused work
benefit from. Yeah.
of a single researcher.
It's something to think about
Yeah, it's something to consider
as we navigate this.
as we navigate this evolving world
Ever-evolving world
of academic publishing.
of academic publishing, yes.
Well, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
You're welcome.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
It really makes you think
It does.
about, what the future holds.
Yeah. Where is this all going?
Yeah. Like, is there even going to be a place
Right.
for solo scholarship
Mm-hmm.
if we're always pushing these big teams?
Yeah. Is it going to become a thing of the past?
Yeah, or are there always going to be certain types of questions
Right.
that really need that focused attention
Yeah. Maybe some things are just
of one person?
better suited to that individual.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
Deep dive.
It's hard to know.
It is.
It really is.
Yeah, but this study definitely
Yeah.
gives us a lot to consider.
It does. And it really seems like this gender solo research gap isn't as big of a deal
Right.
as maybe we thought it was.
Huge chasm.
Yeah.
People were thinking.
And it just highlights that.
Yeah.
It's never as simple as
They're
just,
never saying.
one factor or another.
There's so many factors at play.
It's a very complicated
A lot of things to consider.
issue. And I think this deep dive really helped to unpack that a little bit.
I hope so.
So thanks for joining us on the Depth Dive.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.